Resident Evil as a survival horror franchise has gone through multiple releases over the years, from its pre-rendered backgrounds and tank controls in 1996 to the current trend of the over-the-shoulder action and first-person horror almost 25 years since its debut. But it was decided that Resident Evil, the one that started it all, would get a remake. This would allow those who never played the original to relive it with an improved look and new and improved areas and story. It would go down as one of the best remakes with many high points, but it would also suffer with a couple of flaws. And that is what we are going to go through today. First we will go through the highlights and flaws of both the original and the remake, and then we will go through any highlights and flaws specific to the original and then the remake. Don't forget to like and share this video. Also do subscribe and ring the bell to stay notified of new Resident Evil themed content. Please be aware this video will contain spoilers for Resident Evil. Multiple endings. When I first played Resident Evil, there were not many games I had come across that contained multiple endings, outside of my constant replaying of Sonic the Hedgehog. To me, this was a great feature that I hadn't really experienced before. With both campaigns, with the two main characters, there were a total of 8 different endings, each having far-reaching consequences, from certain team members not surviving the zombie outbreak, to the location of the outbreak being left to run rampant. The remake expanded this further by adding another 4 endings, 2 for each character, giving the game even more replay value by adding choices midway through the game that would significantly affect the ending. As the series went on, less and less of the games featured multiple endings, with only Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and 7 all featuring major or minor departures from the series canon. Hopefully we will see more of this in the future, but for now, Resident Evil will always have the most diverse range of endings in the franchise. Item management. Resident Evil would be the first time I came across an item management system, besides watching old UK game show Nightmare, which restricted players to carrying only 2 items when they had to choose clue objects. Resident Evil would have a slightly different system, restricting you to 6 or 8 items depending on which character you played as, with Chris Redfield able to carry 6 objects and Jill Valentine being able to carry 8 objects. This included weapons and ammo as well as puzzle items and key objects. This added another layer of stress to the game and forced you to backtrack through the areas several times to retrieve and stash away items via the item boxes. Again, this mechanic would return in the remake, with the addition of objects you would gain through the game, but these would not take up item slots. These would include daggers, taser batteries, and grenades. Puzzles. Resident Evil is mainly known for its boss fights, BOWs, horror atmosphere, and cheesy dialogue.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
But another aspect which is sometimes overlooked while being a core component has been its puzzles. We have seen many kinds of puzzles over the installments, utilising mechanical devices, shadows, mathematics, and creative solutions. The first Resident Evil would rely on a lot of object-based puzzles to allow progression within the game, but there were a few unique ones, such as the armour room gas trap, the shotgun rack ceiling trap, and the V-Jolt chemical mixing puzzle. The remake would expand on some of these puzzles and add new ones, like the death masks, jewellery boxes, and the gravestone crests. Even more elaborate puzzles, like the X-rays in the laboratory beneath the mansion, were added in and would be among some of the best puzzles in the series. Sadly, puzzles would take a back seat, as more recent installments would have a focus on action, at least until Resident Evil 7 brought them back to the fold. Music and sound effects. Something that is often taken for granted when it comes to horror games is the music and sound effects. We tend to remember the visuals and the jump scares more, but the musical score used in Resident Evil was iconic. From the moment you meet your first zombie, to the moment the Cerberus leaps through the window, and when the ceiling begins slowly descending, the intense music ramps up the anxiety. Even wandering the halls of the mansion, the guardhouse and the underground labs all have haunting tunes as you explore. On top of this, the sounds of the zombies slowly shuffling and sniffing the air when they can't see you is unsettling. The growls of the Cerberus as they prepare to launch at you, hunters shrieking as they leap through the air and swipe at you, All these sounds add to the already intense musical track and visceral imagery. The music and audio would gain a remix in the director's cut for the PS1 and for the remake. A lot of the music would come back and become even more intense. Add in the new sounds from the Crimson Heads and Lisa Trevor, then you have an even more horrifying experience. Lore and backstory documents. Something that would be a recurring feature of the Resident Evil franchise would be the documents and diaries detailing the stories of those in the background, whether they were killed or they were side characters, or if there were more information and clues about locations and items. Resident Evil would kick off this trend with documents like the Botany Book, Keeper's Diary, and Plant 42 report, and even a slideshow in the underground lab. The Keeper's Diary in particular set the tone for the air of mystery, while also showing the slow process of mutation and deterioration in the Keeper. The remake would add more lore and backstory to many areas and characters, and new characters like the Trevor family were introduced, and a lot of the documents focused primarily on George and Lisa Trevor. Ink ribbons. Many games just let you save or autosave with little consequences. What's to stop you saving every single time you have hit a milestone that you have achieved, whether it be beating a mini-boss, gaining an item, or just discovering a new area? Resident Evil changed this with the ink ribbons. Using strategically placed typewriters to allow you to save was one of the best decisions made by Capcom, even limiting the amount of ink ribbons to make you carefully decide when to save. The remake keeps this feature, and in higher difficulties makes it so you can't save as often or in as many set locations. Sadly, this feature would be dropped come Resident Evil 4, at least until Resident Evil 7 when we got the cassette tapes instead, and the ink ribbons made a return in Resident Evil 2's remake, but these would only be used on higher difficulties. Difficulty. When looking at a game like Resident Evil, you would expect it to be a bit of a challenge, but sometimes that challenge would be really unfair. With the first release of the original game, you had no difficulty settings and it was determined more by which character you chose, with Jill being an easy normal option and Chris being a hard option. Mainly because Jill had the advantage of starting with a gun, had Barry as a supporting character who could help out sometimes, and also having the lockpick. On the other hand, Chris started with just a knife, needed the sword key and small keys instead of a lockpick, and Rebecca Chambers was not much of a helpful character except during the guardhouse section. But on the other hand, Chris did have a higher resistance to damage compared to Jill. Barry even negates the need to solve the falling ceiling puzzle, but Chris has to solve it to properly progress. The limited amount of ammo throughout both campaigns makes it harder still to item manage against enemies. Speaking of enemies, eventually you would encounter the Hunters, which are so difficult to fight with no kind of assisted aiming to help. The director's cut would allow for new modes like Trainee, Standard and Advanced, but each would have their pros and cons like double enemies or ammo, and even moving key items and enemy placement to make it easier or harder. The remake and remaster would go further by adding in extra modes like True Survivor, which prevented item boxes from being linked anymore, or even worse, Invisible Enemy Mode. If you're a glutton for punishment, then give Invisible Enemy Mode a try, but be prepared to rage quit a lot. No clear canon story. Considering that Resident Evil's story is an amalgamation of B-movie horror tropes, Western horror, and zombie themes, I think it's harsh to say that the plot wasn't thought through properly. If Resident Evil hadn't been successful after launch, then we may have never got the sequels, novels, CGI films, and the not-so-stellar live-action film series. While the plot itself overall was hammy, the two separate campaigns didn't help explaining which story was canon, but the one explanation we seem to get the most is that the overall story is canon, but neither campaign is canon. Considering either main character is locked away in the underground lab from the start of the opposite character's campaign, this presents one of the many problems. With Chris's campaign, Barry is missing, presumed dead, while in Jill's campaign there is no sign of Rebecca Chambers. Take into account that Jill, Chris, Rebecca, Barry, Wesker and Brad all need to survive to the end of the story for the sequels to make sense. The existing campaigns just don't help. The remake complicated matters further by not trying to explain how everyone survives to the end of the story again, while also making additions like Lisa Trevor and more hints as to Barry being Wesker's right-hand man. While Rebecca doesn't make another appearance in the games, besides the prequel Resident Evil 0, she still plays a role in the CGI film Resident Evil Vendetta, which is considered official series canon. If Resident Evil ever gets a second remake in the vein of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, they should use this chance to try have the two separate stories make more sense with their campaigns. The combat knife. We come to something that would be a recurring flaw for the Resident Evil franchise in general, at least until Resident Evil 4, and this is the combat knife, your starting weapon which causes minimal damage and brings a lot of risk with its use. With the basic handgun, at least you could keep some distance with your enemies, but the knife required you to be within reaching distance of a zombie or Cerberus, with more chance of you getting hurt than the enemy. Even if you knocked an enemy to the ground with a different weapon, then use the knife repeatedly, it would take more time and effort than the gun, but it still would save you a couple of bullets. The knife itself is only needed for one environmental puzzle, and has no practical use for most of the game. The remake doesn't really improve upon the knife, with pretty much the same use as the original and only a slight increase in damage to help attack downed enemies. The combat knife has earned its reputation as one of the most useless weapons in the Resident Evil franchise. The Director's Cut. When first released, Resident Evil was a great game with a lot of replay time. Then Capcom pushed it further by releasing the Director's Cut, adding in new difficulty options which are Training, Standard, and Advanced. Training is identical to Standard except ammo and ink ribbons are doubled. Advanced changes up enemy placements and numbers, along with locations of key items. There was also a hidden option in the menu when holding right for several seconds, making advanced mode a little easier by giving you double ammo and ink ribbons. A few other changes included different camera angles for some of the rooms, some remixed music and audio throughout, Forrest Speyer being changed into a zombie as a new jump scare, and finally an auto-aim feature which helped the gameplay a lot. Opening FMV. Live-action FMVs have always been one of the more frowned-upon aspects of the gaming industry. While mainly used as part of the Command & Conquer franchise to varying effect, none are more famous than the opening FMV for Resident Evil, and not for the right reasons. A huge flaw that plagues live-action FMVs in general has been the considerably low-budget look that is common among videos, Command & Conquer 3 onwards being the exception, but still it doesn't prevent the hammy acting. Resident Evil fails on multiple levels with this, from the Z-list actors being made up with bad hair dye like Albert Wesker, or little set or props to work with, to the appallingly bad acting and range of emotion. This doesn't really set the tone for a survival horror in the right way at all. If anything, you're mildly laughing at this FMV, unless you're watching the uncut version of the intro, which is way more bloody and violent than the censored version released across Europe and the USA. At least the uncensored version built up the horror of the game a little more. Even the reactions and lines of Joseph Frost, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine in particular are also laughably bad. The closing FMVs make up for this scene slightly, by not having any dialogue at all. Unfairness of hunters. The hunters are always going to be one of the most iconic creatures in the franchise, along with zombies, Cerberus, tyrants, Nemesis, and the Ganados. But in the first Resident Evil, these creatures are introduced just over the halfway point, with little warning. Once you return to the mansion, after being in the guardhouse, you're back in the corridor leading to the courtyard, but an FMV kicks in, showing a hunter sprinting towards your location. Then cut back to the gameplay, this quick reptilian BOW flies out of a corridor with limited view. Unless you're playing the director's cut of this game with auto-aim on, you will have to manually aim at it, which makes it an extremely difficult target to hit. Considering the last creatures you fought were the zombies and the Cerberus, which didn't pose too much of a challenge, jumping from them to the hunters is a steep climb in difficulty. To make it worse, if your health is at half or lower, a single swipe from one of these things can kill you. While they would become more manageable and fairer to fight over the game, it is still a shock to the system when they turn up for the first time. Lack of weapon variety. This is a little nitpicky for a first installment of a survival horror game debuting on the PS1. But the lack of weapon variety, especially in Chris's campaign, is just annoying. If we list out every single weapon available throughout the game, both shared and exclusive, this is what we end up with. The combat knife, the handgun, the shotgun, the Colt Python Magnum, the rocket launcher, the flamethrower, and the bazooka. The ammo variety of the bazooka makes up for this slightly, but disregarding the combat knife and rocket launcher, the knife for its lack of use, and the rocket launcher for it being an unlockable and not being able to aim up or down. The remaining items are not that varied really. The flamethrower can't be refueled, The Colt Python has extremely limited ammo, which needs to be saved for boss fights and hunters at the minimum. That leaves the handgun and shotgun as your only main use weapons throughout both campaigns. But again, the handgun becomes nearly redundant by the halfway point of the game. While all the above helps with the survival horror elements of the game, the fact that not one machine gun is available, or some upgraded versions of existing weapons are around, doesn't help much. But this would only prove to be a minor gripe and would be improved upon in the remake. Improved level layout. When the remake was brought out, most assumed this would just be a straight visual update with improved dialogue and story, but Capcom decided to make use of some of the previously cut areas from the original game, and add in some unused characters and enemies too. The mansion and surrounding areas face some of the biggest overhauls, with the mansion gaining several new rooms and expanded areas, along with the more gothic and dirty look. This improved the game dramatically. The aqua ring beneath the guardhouse saw a huge expansion too, resembling more of the underground lab's look. That and the Neptune BOWs playing more of a role in the area helps a great deal. Even puzzles were improved upon or revamped completely to stop players of the original game to breeze through it. Improved dialogue. While not much of an improvement, the dialogue was redone and revamped to make it less laughable. While we still got the Jill sandwich line, a lot of the other dialogue was improved upon. Even new interactions were made, such as the new encounters with Richard, Barry, and Wesker, all littered through both campaigns. While still cheesy in places, it is a step up from the original, at least until we start taking steps backwards in Resident Evil 4 onwards. Lisa Trevor. A character exclusive only to the remake, would be like Mr. X in Resident Evil 2, with sporadic appearances and being unkillable. The character was the daughter of architect George Trevor and his wife Jessica Trevor, the family themselves playing a key role in the backstory as the creators of the mansion complex, and also, with Lisa in particular, the reason the T virus and many other viruses afterwards would come to be. Lisa, having been experimented on for over a decade, has slowly become a hulking, gangly creature who is obsessed with finding her mother. She wears the faces of those she kills over her own, and sprouts several tentacles when damaged or when fighting in her latter mutation. Her anguished moans and rattling chains send chills down your spine as you explore the mansion and the underground areas. This makes Lisa one of the biggest highlights of the remake. Richard AIKEN. Originally, Richard didn't have much of a role, besides being a small fetch quest, which resulted in you receiving a radio, which had little value besides a couple of moments of Brad sending garbled messages. But Richard's story is expanded a little more by giving him a role almost on par with Rebecca, having him being a supporting character during the Yawn boss fight, with him potentially dying at the jaws of Yawn in Jill's campaign, or being devoured saving Chris from the Neptune sharks. In both campaigns, Jill and Chris can gain Richard's assault shotgun to replace the standard one. While quite a minor overall change, it gave the Yawn boss battle and the encounter with the Neptunes a bit more emotional weight with Richard's death. New game modes. While the Resident Evil Director's Cut gave us the option of 3 different difficulties, it still felt too similar between easy and normal mode. The remake retains the 3 difficulties, but changes them from very easy, easy, normal, and hard, and then adds on the real survivor mode and invisible enemy mode. Invisible enemy mode is self-explanatory, with all enemies being invisible except in reflections of the environment. Also, in the brief moments that you are attacked by an enemy, it will become visible. If you stab an enemy with a defensive item like a dagger, it will stay lodged in, giving you a moving target. Then there's the real survivor mode, which stops all the item boxes from being linked together, meaning any item you left in one room won't be available in any other rooms. Both modes also prevent you from using auto-aim to ramp up the difficulty even further. Beating the invisible enemy mode results in you getting a message from Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami congratulating you on your win. A great final achievement for your hard work across all difficulties. The Armour Room Puzzle. The original puzzle from Resident Evil was quite a simple one, but lethal if you didn't get it right. But in the remake, the puzzle is more complex, which is a welcome change, but because the clue on the wall was very pixelated, it made it difficult to figure out how to solve it. This would also be more frustrating, rather than taxing on your problem-solving skills. since it took a lot of trial and error to get it right. Unless you play through the game several times or look it up, this puzzle could be annoying at best. The Neptune boss fight. I can't really class this as a boss fight, since it's really over in less than a minute at best. When you're down in the aqua ring and the water has been drained, you have two small Neptunes, and the large Neptune, all stranded. The small Neptunes can be killed, but they pose no threat. The larger one corners you after you try to retrieve a key needed to reach Plant 42. Now you have two ways to deal with this. Push a console into the water, then turn on the generator to kill it, or just fire bullets at it until it dies. But there is zero risk of you dying unless you're daft enough to step right down into the water in front of him. Calling this a boss fight is like saying the crocodile in Resident Evil 2 was the most difficult challenge. But considering this fight took place in a partially submerged room, it was always going to be difficult to make a decent boss fight when based in water. We wouldn't see a decent water-based boss fight until the Del Lago encounter in Resident Evil 4. The missed chance to expand on characters. While the original Resident Evil didn't really explore a lot of the other STARS members, namely Richard, Joseph, Enrico, Forrest and Kenneth, the remake missed out on the chance to expand on many of these characters, excluding Richard. The original game at least had some backstory in the game manuals. The remake didn't attempt to look into the characters' backstories via unlockable content, or any backstory in the manuals like the original. Richard did get a bit more story in-game, and Kenneth's death was explored a little bit more via a VHS tape. But besides these moments, little was done to look into supporting characters. Forrest got the chance to be a more powerful zombie, and be a recurring enemy that could instantly kill you on higher difficulties. But again, no further story to the character. The introduction of the Trevor family made up for this, but it was still a missed opportunity to look more into the STARS members. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video exploring the highlights and flaws of Resident Evil and its remake. Please leave a comment below. You can also comment to us directly on Twitter or Instagram, or you can like our Facebook page. Don't forget to like and share this video. Also do subscribe and ring the bell to stay notified of new Resident Evil themed content. Thank you, stay safe, and I'll see you again soon.